Alright, so not to toot my own horn, but I think we've got a lineup here most people won't recognize. So let's start with the recognizable King Tut conspiracy. Anything around King Tut is a mystery since the tomb's discovery in 1922. The curse, his age, the disabilities, and most importantly, what the hell happened to the kid? And I'm allowed to call him a kid, I'm older than him, at least in alive years. The reason we can't tell is because there's a couple options for what happened to him. King Tut had malaria and suffered from some disabilities physically due to, well, mom and dad are also auntie and uncle, you know? He had a club foot, a G-ways spine, a cleft palate, so he was always destined to die at a young age, unfortunately. But when he died at 19 in 1323 BC, it wasn't of any disability. His mummy shows that he had a fractured and blood-clotted skull, which made people believe he was stabbed or conked on the back of the head. But it was also believed that his head was damaged while his body was being embalmed. But he also broke his knee shortly before he died, in a way that implies he could have been killed in a chariot accident. And then newer CT analysis of scans in 2003 show that Tut was embalmed without his heart and interior chest wall, and that confirms that these structures couldn't have been removed by either tomb robbers or the discoverer Howard Carter. It happened before mummification. Thus now it's suggested that a crushing injury to the chest was cause of death. The extensive crushing and tearing of a hippopotamus bite, that is. So who knows what happened to Tut? Was it a coup, a chariot, a hippo? For now, it remains unsolved. And like Tut, his wife remains a mystery. So up next is what happened to Ai and Akhenaten. The coup theory for Tut's death revolved around his elderly chief advisor and successor Ai, who is depicted in even Tut's burial chamber, and decided since Tut didn't have kids, he should seize the crown himself. But Tut had a wife, and the kings of Egypt could be a man or a woman. So when Tut died, his wife Anne was terrified of the corrupt priests and the rising power of General Horemheb, also of being forced to marry a servant such as Ai. So she writes to the king of the Hittites and offers herself and the throne of Egypt to one of his sons. Prince Zanzanza sets out for Egypt, but is killed when he arrives because Horemheb knew An's plan. So who did An have to marry? A, the master of horses and thieves, exactly what she had dreaded, and now a commoner's on the throne. By the way, some believe that Ai was the father of Queen Nefertiti, and Nefertiti was An's mother, so do the math. Together they assumed the throne before Tut was even in the ground. Ai dies in 1319, but An vanished from the face of the earth around 1316 to be replaced with his new wife Tay. History doesn't know where An went. Did A force her to marry him, thus legitimizing his claim to the throne, only to kill her? Could she have also been victim of the known serial killer Horemheb? Following the demise of Tut and Ai, Horemheb did become pharaoh, and while he mysteriously had the names of Akhenaten, Tut, and Ai removed from the royal list of pharaohs, which suggests he had a personal reason for eradicating those rulers. He also struck records of An, but not the second wife Tay. There's been no discovery regarding An's death or burial to date, and genuinely no one knows what happened to her. I've made mention of this noble battle before, so let's talk about how the Hippo King died. When the mummy of King Sekenenretau II was removed from his gift wrap in 1886, he immediately stood out from the other pharaohs discovered alongside him. His skull looks like someone had literally pointed a sandblaster in its mouth, and the hands were also all mangled. Also, he showed signs of decay pre-mummification, which was weird for Egyptians. But no surviving records shed light on how he met his grisly end. So it was time to play Operation and find out some important bits. And they did. The angles of impacts and a combination of Hyksos and Egyptian blades matched the shape of sex wounds, all and only to his head. So they CT the skull in 2021, and previously historically reported injuries are all there, but an additional injury on the right lateral side of the skull that had been concealed by the embalmers beneath the layers of material is finally depicted. But if this was on the battlefield, why were the king's hands tied? Also, why was he attacked by multiple assailants from above while kneeling, which was the position he died in? The researchers suggest that Sek was most likely captured in battle against Hyksos and then bludgeoned in a ceremonial execution while his hands were bound behind his back, either on the battlefields or in a dungeon or something. They suggest he died as a result of fighting to liberate his kingdom, also the hippo pool, and rather in a scandalous way such as a palace conspiracy. So while we may have the why and the how of Sek's death, but we don't really have the who, the what, and the where. So, yo guys, we got some news. A new mummy just dropped. Hot off the press of 2014, we got a new lineup for the most debaucherous royals around. Said tomb is about 3,600 years old and rests 300 miles from Cairo, and guys, it's the first evidence of the Abdos dynasty that's apparently thrived 36,000 years ago during ancient Egypt's Second Intermediate Period, a necropolis of a lost dynasty that has only been hypothesized to exist until now. Sakembe ruled until around 1650 BC between the Middle Kingdom's end and the New Kingdom's start, and was found in a 60-ton sarcophagus chamber just absolutely ripped apart by grave robbers and left scattered, undisturbed for a millennia. So, how did a whole ass dynasty just go up and missing for 3,600 years? And how does a buried pharaoh go undiscovered for so long? Ancient Egyptians were committed recyclers. Sakembe's giant quartzite sarcophagus chamber came from a royal tomb built originally for a pharaoh called Sobektep, who lived around 150 years before him. Why look where you've already looked, you know? Now for the mysterious death. Homeboy was cut up, a total of 18 wounds. 3 major blows to his skull have the distinctive size and curve of battle axes used during Egyptian's Second Intermediate Period. This means, like Sek, we're looking at a battlefield, ambush, or ceremonial execution, and we have no idea where it occurred or how. Possibly the king died in a battle against the Hyksos king, who at that time ruled the northern Egypt from their capital of Avarius, or in struggles against enemies of south of Egypt. Alternatively, Sakembe might have also had political opponents, possibly kings based at Thebes, who notoriously hated his ass. It had to come up at some point, so let's find out what's up with Cleo. After Roman forces crushed the Egyptian army in the Battle of Atticum, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, where they watched their former allies and supporters defect to Octavian's side and had a 2-story mausoleum quickly constructed on Cleo's palace grounds. Hearing a false report that she had died, Antony jumped the gun a little and stabbed himself on the spot with his own sword. His men carried him to Cleopatra and he died in her arms, looking like a moron. Meanwhile, according to Plutarch, a member of Octavian's staff secretly warns Cleopatra a month later that Octavian's taken her to Rome with him. Hell no, I won't go. Cleopatra shuts herself away in the mausoleum with 2 maidservants, Iris and Charmian, and they sent a note to Octavian saying, "Suck it, and by the way, bury me with Antony." Octavian's men rush to the mausoleum, bust the door down, find an already dead Cleo and maids. This is the most repeated theory of Cleo's death, but it's riddled with holes. Apparently, cobra venom did her in, but cobras were too big to be smuggled in, and venom's actually a really slow death, making it hard to believe the snake was able to kill Cleo and her 2 maids in the short time it took for Octavian to receive her note and get there. If she did poison herself, there was no way it was snake venom. With no known eyewitnesses too, and no primary written records and accounts of Cleopatra's death, pretty much all we know comes from one man, Octavian, who is the main suspect if we look at it as a killing. He certainly had a motive to want Cleopatra dead, as her lineage posed a potential threat to the dominance in Egypt. Looks shady that the second she's dead too, he directs his guards to hunt down her teenage son. Then Octavian made Egypt a province with himself as emperor. He changed his name to shed the negative image his Octavian title now carried after being suspected of killing everyone's favorite queen. Last but not least, Octavian/Augustus ensured his version of Cleopatra and her death, snakebite and all, would be written the same in every single one of his subsequent memoirs, so that one very specific version of the story could live on for centuries to come, because that's not suspicious at all.
Number 5, fake beard. I need one of these because, yeah, I tried recently and it disappeared off the channel. I was too ashamed to come back. Long before Cleopatra, Hatshepsut was the first woman to obtain power as a pharaoh. This is pretty impressive. She was the 6th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. There were just a few that were women in total, but during her reign back in the mid-1400s BC, following the death of Thutmose II, she was determined on being portrayed as a male pharaoh. So the pharaoh fake beard, the massive muscles, historians believe that this was done as an act of politics. Now after her passing, come 1458 BC, her stepson took the throne, Thutmose III, and he destroyed everything in her name. Just scripted. Back then it wasn't, hard to just, you break one thing and then everything's gone. Well, mostly everything. Now we have this idiot being like, hey, fake beards, look at that, you missed one. Number 4, game night. I love board games, even Monopoly, believe it or not. I have the patience for it every now and then. But ancient Egyptians, they also fancied a board game, turns out, who knew? Dogs and Jackals, Mehen, Senet, and 20 Squares. These were all popular go-to games for their ancient Egyptian cottage weekends. Mehen was played around 2500 BC, and the goal was to reach the center of the spiral first. The board was a coiled snake almost. It was quite beautiful. Senet was the most popular game, queens and kings alike would play this one. Senate had a long board with 30 squares painted on it. Now, of course, the rules are still unknown and heavily debated, just like Monopoly. But you had 3 rows of 10 squares. The last 5 squares are decorated, so it's assumed that this game was themed on the afterlife. Plus, King Tut was buried with one of these game boards. There's something very Jumanji about this that I want to know more of, but I also don't want to know more of. Why was he buried with a board game? That's kind of terrifying. There's also some paintings of Queen Nefertiti playing a board game of sorts. Yeah, it kind of looks a lot like chess. Imagine playing a pharaoh in chess. My palms would be so sweaty. I'd be like, checkmate, please don't exile me. Thanks so much. Let's play again sometime. Peace. Number 3. The first peace treaty. Bizarre at the time? Absolutely. Definitely. This is a first. The first peace treaty in history was back in 1271 BC. Now, at this point in time, Egyptians and the Hittite Empire, they were fighting over modern-day Syria. Now, this conflict had been lasting centuries, and come 1274 BC, the Battle of Kadesh was now underway. At this point, there's tons of bloodshed, no clear victor in sight, so what's left to do at this point? A peace treaty, right? Hopefully, ideally, Ramses II and King Hatshepsut III both negotiated a peace treaty where both sides would aid each other if a third party decided to now get involved. A copy of the treaty can be found in New York right above the entrance to the United Nations Security Council chamber. Pretty impressive. I have a license plate above my room, so that's almost as cool, I guess. It's also in the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest peace treaty, so that's how you know it's official. Guinness confirms it. Moving on. Number 2, renewed passport. Now I'm thinking about where my passport is and I'm immediately panicking. I'm like, oh, which shelf? Ooh. Before our big bad haunting number 1, we'll do a fun one with some recent history. This is cheeky. Passports are important and they're a pain to replace. But did you know that you can still get one even if you've been dead for thousands of years? Well, now you do. You just have to be a pharaoh though. That's the only rule. You have to be a pharaoh or some sort of king. Pharaoh Ramses II. We just talked about him, one of ancient Egypt's greatest rulers. He got a passport back in 1974. Insane. The same time my grandma did, probably. After being exhumed and put on display for so long, it was decided that it's now time to send this lost king off to Paris to get touched up. Now, obviously, you're not going to list this pharaoh king as luggage. That would be super disrespectful. So the Egyptian government gave Ramses II his own official Egyptian passport for his commute, with a photo. Just in case you didn't know. On the passport, he had his info. It's all great. He had his age, very old, occupation, a king. And in case it wasn't obvious, it was stated that the king was deceased. Looking at him, you're like, oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, go on in. Definitely dead. For sure dead. Don't even have to look twice. We're good. And finally, number 1, trusty servant. In ancient Egypt, it was common for servants to accompany their masters into the afterlife. Whenever they go, now you have to go. Horrible, right? This practice reflected the belief that individuals needed assistance and companionship even in the realm of the dead. Hashtag needy. Servants were considered essential for ensuring the comfort and well-being of the deceased here and again in the afterlife, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but again, long time ago, different beliefs. They would be depicted in tomb paintings and inscriptions, and their statues or figurines would be placed in these tombs to then serve the deceased. These servants were believed to continue their duties in the afterlife, providing sustenance, performing daily tasks, and maintaining the deceased social status. Like, when does it end, guy? Like, come on. The inclusion of servants in burial rituals exemplifies the importance of social hierarchy and the idea of continuity in ancient Egyptian culture. So while it's crazy to us, it's very important then. It's quite important now. Fucking crazy, but it's still pretty important.
Topping our list at number 10 hasn't actually happened yet. April 13th, 2029. Some of you may know by now about that recent Leo DiCap and Jen Lawrence movie Don't Look Up. Well, it seems like we're about to experience a little bit of that reality, as it's predicted on Friday, April 13th, 2029, the most hazardous asteroid to Earth, 99942 Apophis, is set to pass Earth a mere 18,000 miles away. That's a lot closer than any of the satellites we ourselves have put into orbit, so put that in perspective. Now rest assured, because this could be a lot scarier than it is if it was to come any closer, but journal articles state that there's no real damage that will occur. However, there is some potential for some intense heat or even an effect on some gravitational pulls. Personally, the idea that a meteor of any kind could just come crashing into us with no warning and just end it all, yeah, that's pretty intense. A terrible ship captain puts January 13th, 2012 at number 9 on the countdown. It's a beautiful Italian getaway and life is good. That is until the Costa Concordia cruise ship stuck off of a reef on the Isla di Gregorio and began to tilt. Passengers and staff were quick to start moving themselves against the tilt as fast as possible, being evacuated on the lifeboats. However, as the ship came to rest completely on its side in the shallow waters, survivors had to be airlifted to shore by a helicopter. Tragically, 32 people did
in this wreck, and a massive salvage operation took 19 hours to raise the ship from the reef where it came to rest, using multiple cranes. The captain did not go down with the ship, he actually fled during the evacuation. If you know anything about boats, it's actually not a joke that the captain is to remain on board with everyone else until everyone is safely off, even at the cost of his own life. The captain of the Concordia, Francesco Cittadino, was arrested for multiple manslaughter charges and abandoning the ship instead of directing evacuation. Next up, tragedy in Evansdale. July 13th, 2012 is number 8 in the countdown. Friday, July 13th, 2012, cousins Elizabeth Collin and Lyric Cook Morrissey were dropped off at grandmother Wilma Cook's house. They leave at noon for an afternoon of outdoor adventuring. Not long after, they're spotted by Myers Lake, and later at Lake Avenue, and then never again. Their grandmother, concerned at their lack of return after a few hours, called family and then called police. What started as a small police search turned into a sheriff and fire department search, but all that was ever recovered was the girls' bikes and Elizabeth's purse. After this, FBI is brought in with infrared aircrafts, cadaver dogs, and they combed the lake, but still no luck. 5 months later, the worst case scenario is confirmed when hunters in the Seven Bridges wildlife area stumble across 2 bodies, who were eventually identified as Elizabeth and Lyric, found 25 miles from where they originally went missing. Autopsy confirmed the girls had met foul play, but that's the farthest police had progressed, leading the cousins to remain a cold case. This case is incredibly similar to that of the Delphi, Indiana murders of Abby Williams and Liberty German, who went out to enjoy a walk on a local trail and also disappeared, and speculation of a serial killer in this region has existed for a long time. Both sets of girls were Caucasian, similar in age and appearance, and both were found in rural areas by hunters. Chillingly, the dates of both girls had vanished. 7/13/12 and 12/13/17 are anagrams of each other. Number 7, a real-life horror story happened in San Diego on April 12, 2012. 22-year-old Brittany Kilgore got out of a bad relationship and was starting anew. She had a lot on her plate and she was looking for help in moving. Unfortunately, she didn't have any friends who could, but she did meet Luis Ray Perez, who asked if he could assist her. He even had 5 of his friends come and help her too, on the sole condition she partied with him for just a night. She needed help and she was newly single. What harm could come from it? It was a couple days later that the body of Brittany Kilgore is found. Who'd Brittany met was not who she thought. Perez had a pregnant wife, Dorothy Maraglino, and a mistress, Jessica Lopez, back at home who acted as SMA puppets and partners. These 3 had concocted a scheme wherein Perez would find and abduct a woman to be used as an unwilling participant. Evidence showed Brittany to be their victim, as her DNA was found in their dungeon and items such as handcuffs in their home. Perez, Maralingo, and Lopez were all found guilty, and all 3 received life sentence without parole and will be deservedly rotting in prison. October 13th, 1972 is number 6 in the countdown, when 174 people were killed in the deadliest airplane crash in Russian history. The plane involved in the incident was a 4-year-old model with no prior history of malfunction. As it approached Moscow at the height of 3,900 feet, Moscow Air Control gave the instruction to descend to 1,300 feet. The crew confirmed the instructions and started the descent as per usual, but rather than leveling off at the 1,300 feet, the plane suddenly lost altitude until it crashed into the ground at 390 miles per hour with no apparent reason as to why. To make matters worse, the plane was only 3 kilometers from the landing strip where it crashed, and at no point were the spoilers retracted or landing gear prepared. The lack of mic communication to the pilots after the descent began also leaves us without answers. While there has never been an explanation for the crash's cause, many speculate it was a lightning strike. But many don't ignore the coincidence that—
Number 5, a twin thing. Identical twins Helen Mae Cook and Clara Mae Mitchell couldn't have been closer growing up. The twin sisters were born February 2nd, 1932, and from their childhood and throughout their entire lives, they were best friends. At age 83, Clara sadly died of a heart attack, and then only hours later, Helen also passed away. See, Helen had been battling Alzheimer's for quite some time, so at any moment she could have succumbed to her illness. But the fact that it happened only hours later of her sisters, it almost feels like when Debbie Reynolds passed away a day after Carrie Fisher. That was a terrible week. That was back in 2016, believe it or not. Feels like it was only last year. Crazy. Time's going way too fast. Number 4, Roberto Clemente. Your parents may know about this one, pretty famous. This one's a little old as far as sports history goes. The Pittsburgh Pirates had a right fielder in 1972, Roberto Clemente. He was actually the first Latin American player to reach 3,000 hits He was the 11th in the entire major league. Not an easy feat to get to at all. Now this hit was supposed to be the best moment of his life, not his last hit ever. Yeah, the Hall of Famer was unfortunately killed shortly after the game in a plane crash right off the coast of Puerto Rico. Roberto was on his way to a humanitarian trip to Nicaragua. Now it's sad, but it's also pretty beautiful that he got 3,000 hits. It was almost like he was meant to hit that last pitch before his untimely and horrible demise. Number 3. The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility. I hate when book titles have like the end part that doesn't have to be there. Like just call it The Wreck of the Titan. God damn it. Author Robert Morgan wrote The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility in 1898. Now keep in mind, this was 14 years before the Titanic sank in real life. Now there's a handful of similarities here in the novel and in the real life tragic event. I mean, for starters, the ship's names? Come on. The fictional Titan and the very real Titanic? It's a bit odd. Both ships were initially described as unsinkable. Both didn't happen. And both hit icebergs on the starboard side of the ship, and both were 400 miles off Newfoundland when they sank, which of course just happens to be on an April night. A lot of coincidences there, it's pretty spooky. Now the main disaster here for both of these tales, again one being fictional, one not, was a lack of lifeboats on board. Yeah, that always rubbed me the wrong way. The 20 lifeboats on the Titanic could only have saved 1,178 people. That's around 1/3 of the number traveling on board. Doesn't make any sense at all. What a bright idea. Bound to fail. Number 2. Dennis's the Menaces. Do we remember Dennis the Menace? I remember a movie growing up, but the cartoon, that was a long time before me. So maybe your parents read some Dennis issues, I don't know. Dennis the Menace hit the pages in March 1951 alongside his famous furry sidekick Ruff. But somehow, some way, the same month, that same year, the UK launched their very own version of Dennis the Menace, and there are no signs of plagiarism. Just an odd coincidence, I guess. The characters were made independently, so now there's 2 Menaces out there, which is just terrible. That's like an Avengers level threat. We gotta watch these 2 guys over here. I feel like the UK version's way more badass, you know what I mean? Like he goes and causes real problems in pubs. The UK version is always better than the American. The Office, Dennis the Menace, chocolate? Oh, definitely chocolate. For sure chocolate. Now I want to book a flight. And finally, number 1, the Comet family. Ooh, this one is so good. The odds of being killed by a meteor are 1 in 2 million, right? But even so, back in 1954, residents in Talladega County, Alabama, noticed a ball of fire heading towards them. Now back then we didn't have Twitter or anything. We couldn't warn people that a meteor was gonna hit. We didn't know how big it was, what was going on. It was terrifying. And we also didn't really know how to tell if meteors were coming or not, so it was alarming. It was especially alarming for Anne Elizabeth Hodges, who got hit by that space rock. Yeah, she only got grazed, thankfully, but with these odds, turns out it's still possible. Now cut to even more recent history, the Comet family over in France, their house was hit by a meteor. Yeah, the Comet family was hit by a space rock. It's kind of funny, that's ironic for sure. Their last name hinted them towards their impending doom. Now somebody with their last name McWaters, I'll admit I'm starting to sweat a bit. I don't want to drown now. That definitely sounds like I'm gonna drown.
Number 10 is Mars's light. Heads up Elon, because Nostradamus is a party pooper and his prediction for this year was that the light on Mars will go out. What does that mean? Who knows? The joys of Nostradamus is 70% of his predictions have been proven true, but we never know which ones they'll be. Either way, Nostradamus believed that humanity's quest to colonize Mars would be quashed somehow. Maybe he's predicting Martians, or a Martian power grid, or a Martian power cut, or a Martian whoozy whatsy. I don't know myself. What I do know is good old Elon Musk is planning to use his SpaceX company to send people to Mars by 2026. So some generously predict that this is the source, and some disaster will happen on a trip there, or a trial run, or whatever it may be. Nostradamus loving royal gossip is number 9 in the countdown. Amongst his predictions for 2023, Nostradamus famously quoted, "Because they disapproved of his divorce, a man who later they considered unworthy, the people will force out the king of the islands. A man will replace him who never expected to be king." Seems like our old buddy was maybe a bit of a Princess Diana fan, because many consider this passage to refer to King Charles III, who famously cheated on and divorced the lovely Diana, Princess of Wales. If this foundation is true, then it's assumed that Nostradamus has implicated Charles will be abdicating the throne sometime this year, and that perhaps it may not be to the heir of the throne, Prince of Wales William, who will take the position, but rather Prince Harry. Harry being crowned would explain the reference of a man who never expected to be king. While I may not be following royal family much, I'd kinda love to see how Harry and Meghan being crowned would go down with some of these people. Number 8 is feeling not so great. It's been a hard year, and many countries are facing backlash in which the ways they govern. Their people are angry and vocalize that boldly in public displays, garnering worldwide attention and demands for justice and equity. Nostradamus has predictions that illustrate this change in 2023. Trumpets are shaking in the great controversy, and an agreement that has been broken, which can refer to the betrayal of democratic governments towards the people that they are meant to protect, eluding a rebellion or revolution somewhere on Earth in 2023. Sooner and later, you will see great changes, made dreadful horrors, and vengeance. As you've seen, this had already begun before the new year with the women of Iran. The USA has experienced much protesting in regards to their policing, and the Canadian government in regards to pipeline invasion on indigenous lands. Unfortunately, there are many more examples globally that we can even list. Number 7 is descent from heavenly status. I just like rhymes and subtle puns, it'll make sense in a second. What I'm referring to is Nostradamus' quote, "In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will be Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock amid many tribulations, after which the seven-hilled city will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge the people." In the writings leading up to this quote, he also describes Pope Francis as the last true pope, and the man who will take his place will be dark, dangerous, and power-hungry. A man who will cause a scandal worthy of bringing down the Catholic Church. They've survived a lot of horrible scandals, so I don't want to imagine what could be so big enough to do that. That, or maybe our guy Nostradamus is in over his head on this one. Also, the predicted anti-pope is apparently named Peter, so I mean, if we just don't appoint a guy named Peter with his name, we should be good, right? Alright. This year, the royals are a hot topic for Nostra, which is number 6. Man, he can't keep his nose out this family. Nostradamus also predicted that we would see celestial fire on the royal edifice. That's obviously pretty vague, so there are a couple things we can assume this to be. Taken literally, a meteor could crash into Buckingham Palace, or a fire could magically erupt. In a literal sense, Harry and Meghan could be the center focus again, as their recent Netflix release and book deal have aimed a different kind of firepower at the royal family. One that lit up and tore down the reputation of many members and exposed their bigotry and status bias. On the other hand, if we view this on a broader scale, it could have to do with humanity as a whole and the implementation of a royal hierarchy and status into our society in the first place, and then how over time it evolved into social status of a society. Technically, by that breakdown, we could say that the poverty, lower class, middle class, and high class are the same as the royal hierarchy system in the medieval era, wherein it was peasants, serfs, then high status, and royalty. In which case, celestial fire on a royal edifice could refer to wiping us all out. Just food for thought.
Now we ask ourselves, what happened to Walter? Ain't no way this wasn't a crime, okay? I'm just saying that for everyone familiar with this case now, thanks to Clint Eastwood and Angelina Jolie tearing it up on the big screen with the 2008 film Changeling. Single mom Christine Collins reported her 9-year-old son Walter missing in March of 1928 from their home in Los Angeles. 5 months later, police brought Walter back to Christine, except it wasn't Walter, and Christine knew it was some stupid little placebo punk kid with a badass attitude. But the LA police dismissed Christine's concerns. She's a single mom in the 1920s, working and living on her own without a man. Culturally, that was her tombstone, and the police went so as far as to accuse her of being a terrible mother and having her committed to a mental hospital. The fake Walter Collins obviously outs the fact that he's a fake. He's 9. How the hell does he know to keep a police secret? The real Walter Collins was never found, and over time, authorities came to believe he was one of the victims of convicted killer Gordon Stewart Northcott, with Northcott's mother even making a confession for Walter's death on her son's behalf. Whatever happened to Walter Collins, his body was never found, and no one actually learned what really happened, nor has it been explained why the police were so invested in covering up the boy's disappearance instead of just trying to find him. Hey guys, can you move that coffin real quick? I need to put a subway here. Thanks. 2,500-year mystery, hot off the press of 2020, past and present collided in a very literal way when a 2,500-year-old killing victim was uncovered during an archaeological dig preceding the installation of a high-speed rail line in London. For those of you unaware, under the Crown it is mandatory for archaeologists to comb a site before anything can happen there. This kind of crap is why. While the cause of death wasn't immediately obvious, it was hoped that with time and further examination, the skeleton would yield more clues about who he was and what become of him. Archaeologist Rachel Wood explained he seems to have had his hands tied and he was face down in the bottom of a ditch. There is not many ways you end up like that. She also continued to say if he was struck across the head with a heavy object, you would find a mark on the back of the skull. If he was stabbed, you'd find blade marks on the ribs. So we're hoping to find something like that to tell us how he died. Interestingly though, the large-scale dig that went ahead of the rail line project revealed more than 60 other ancient sites of interest, including the remains of an ancient village nearby. It would have been in use from 3,000 to 2,000 years ago during the Late Bronze Age and survived until the Roman invasion of southern England 2,000 years ago. When there's only a finite space in which to be, how did we lose 3 lighthouse keepers? In 1896, the Board of Trade funded the construction of a lighthouse on the largest of the Flannan Isles. In December of 1899, the lighthouse was completed and lit for the first time. 4 lighthouse keepers were assigned to maintain the lighthouse and work a rotation of 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off. This meant there's always a bare minimum of 3 men on the island at a time. In mid-December of 1900, the 3 men on the island were 43-year-old principal keeper James Ducat, who had a wife and kids and 20 years of experience, the 40-year-old occasional keeper Donald MacArthur, who was married and covering for the first assistant keeper, and the 28-year-old second assistant keeper Thomas Marshall. Around midnight on December 15th, a steamship Arctur passed the Isles. The captain noticed he couldn't see the light from the lighthouse, and the conditions should have allowed him to. When the Arctur arrived in port, they reported the light absence even though it was never communicated to the Northern Lighthouse Board. On December 26th, the lighthouse tender ship Hesperus made a routine visit to the island, and when near the island, Captain James Harvey found it odd the Scottish flag had been removed from the flagpole. He then sounded the horn to get the attention of the 3 lighthouse keepers, but there's no response. They attempt firing a flare. No response. Island seems normal. Entrance gate and entrance door, and the door after that, all locked. However, the kitchen door is found open, and the fire hadn't been lit for several days, and all of the clocks were stopped, every bed empty, every room untouched, and the bodies of 3 men never found. I hope I never meet the attic neighbor. On an evening of March 31st, 1922, on the Hinterkaifeck farm in Bavaria, Germany, 6 residents are slain with a pickaxe. The victims included a husband and wife, Andreas and Kaliziar Gruber, their widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's kids Kaliziar II and Joseph, and the family maid Maria. Joseph and Maria were both killed while in their beds. However, the rest of the family was then killed in the barn and stacked on top of each other. Let's make this worse somehow than a literal pile of corpses. Investigation concluded that their killer actually lived on the farm for 6 days after smoking the whole family. Cattle were still being fed, meals were still being eaten in the kitchen, neighbors saw smoke from the chimney, and the family dog was tied to a post when the mailman came on Saturday. The bodies were discovered the next day because the dog was still there. And now, for even worse, Maria was actually hired the same day she was killed, replacing the previous maid who had quit 6 months earlier due to the house being haunted. Said maid reported to the family hearing footsteps and voices in the attic. Around the time that the previous maid had quit, the Gruber family also started to hear voices from the attic. Add in a set of house keys had gone missing, and unfamiliar newspapers found in the house that nobody had ever seen before, and now there's scratches on the family tool shed like somebody tried to pick the lock. Maybe it's time to check the attic or move? The father Andreas also reports seeing a pair of footsteps leading from the woods towards the back entrance of the family's house. What did you do? Look at that. Damn, that's crazy. Off to go get killed, I guess. What? Despite repeat arrests, nobody has ever been found, and the files were closed in 1955. The house was also demolished. And last but not least, a puzzling puzzle. In 2011, a mass grave was discovered in southern Poland, dating back 5,000 years, and contained the bones of 15 people, including women, young adults, and only 1 man. The DNA testing shows us that the 15 bodies in total are actually related and belonging to the globular amphora culture, which emerged in Central Europe around 3400 to 2800 BC. Polish experts suggested that the people were executed during a ritual ceremony since the remains were found lying close together, bodies and limbs overlapping, implying a consecutive, if not simultaneous, ending for all in, well, the pile. Sorry. While we might be shocked at such a dark discovery, the scientists called the find a intriguing scene. This is not just because they're a bunch of tasteless nerds, but because mysteries like these allow them to test their skills, bringing together several disciplines, including forensic archaeology, criminal anthropology, and the genome-wide analysis. And archaeologists can use this technology to better understand not only how this group lived, but also how and why they died. The archaeologists so far concluded that they may have been killed during a time of dwindling food stocks, which would explain why only women, elders, and young adults were found in the sacrificial pit. Artistic reconstructions of this mass grave
found in Poland illustrate entwined massive bodies, along with an analysis of their kinship relations. Evidently, these individuals were buried by people who knew them well and who carefully placed them in the grave according to familiar relationship.
Kicking off our list at number 10, the Dendera Light. Here we go, going back to ancient aliens, maybe, who knows. The Dendera Light is a controversial image found in the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, Egypt. Now, some theories suggest that this image here depicts an ancient Egyptian light bulb or some advanced electrical technology of some sorts, which is pretty exciting. However, mainstream Egyptologists interpret it as a symbolic representation of religious concepts. That makes more sense than ancient Egyptian light brights, I guess. I guess it's not as fun, but sure, checks out. The bulb is more likely a depiction of the lotus flower, and the central figure holding a snake is associated with the creation myths. So yeah, there's some history there. There's some tea behind. There's some stuff you have to know. The Dendera Light is a subject of debate and speculation to this day, of course, because people want to believe that this is aliens, an alien light show. But there is currently no concrete evidence to support the claim that this represents ancient Egyptian knowledge of electricity or advanced lighting technology of sorts. Again, part of me wants to believe in ancient light bulbs, but maybe I've been playing too much Zelda. That's probably it. That's probably that, maybe. I don't know. Number 9, beer. Yeah, some pretty good stuff coming up next. Ancient Egyptians, they brewed and consumed beer on a daily basis. Now, they considered it a staple of their diet. Cool, me too, I guess. Beer production was primarily a household activity with everybody in the family helping the process, which is great. What does your family taste like? Let's do it. The brewing techniques here involved fermenting grains, barley, and flavoring the beer with dates, honey, and spices. And pretty much anything you wanted. It's your brew. Get creative. Throw random shit in there. See how it tastes. Why not? It's ancient Egypt. Beer had both religious and social significance. Beer would be offered to deities and consumed during festivals and gatherings. Give a deity a Coors Light, you're like, here you go. This ought to cool you down. Rocky Mountain certified, buddy. Stop yelling, stop cursing our lands. It also provided hydration, nutrition, and a means of socializing in ancient Egyptian society, so hard to say no to that. Twist my arm, please. Number 8, curses. Of course, these are real. These are very real. And you'll get cursed if you don't hit that thumbs up. Ancient Egyptian curses are a subject of fascination and speculation, of course. Curses were believed to be supernatural powers wielded by priests or individuals to protect sacred sites and or tombs from desecration. These curses often warned of dire consequences for anyone who disturbed the resting place of a pharaoh or violated these sacred spaces at all. The curses were typically inscribed on tomb walls or objects and invoked the wrath of gods and spirits. Ergo, don't touch my shit. Thanks. Many inscriptions contain symbolic threats rather than the direct supernatural actions. So the curse of the pharaohs is mainly associated with King Tut. This curse gained attention when several individuals involved in the excavation of Tut's tomb just died unexpectedly. However, these deaths can be attributed to natural causes or coincidences, of course, but the timing here was it's a little cursed. Nobody really knows, right? We want to believe. Maybe it's fun to believe. That way we won't steal things from the dead, right? Let's go that way. Number 7, a pet hippo. Are you a dog person? Are you a cat person? How about hippos? They're fun. They'll maybe eat you, who knows? Real quick, do you have any idea how fast hippos are? I had no clue my entire life. I thought they were fat and fun and stationary. No, hippos can run as fast as 50 kilometers an hour. Their bite is 3 times as powerful as the bite of a lion's. Yeah, so you shouldn't fuck with them. You shouldn't fuck with them with a PH. The Pharaoh Menace was Egypt's first pharaoh. We refer to him as the lost pharaoh because, well, for starters, he was alive a very long time ago, 3000 BC, don't know much about him, but also he was killed by his pet hippo, therefore definitely lost. We lost him fast and loud. This king spent over 60 years on the throne, and after all of that, all the wars and conquest and all the treaties, after all that, a hippo got him. What a shame. I mean, to be fair, I don't think there's a harder way to go out as a king. A hippo kills you? I don't know, that's pretty badass. That's like top 3 coolest ways to die, next to like the megalodon. I don't know. Number 6, Israel Sphinx claws. Here we go, some ancient Wolverine stuff coming in here. The mystery of the Sphinx claws in Israel. This refers to a set of large limestone claws that were of course discovered near the city of Tel Hazor. Now these claws resemble feline paws of some sort. They're very sharp, very large, very intimidating, and they are believed to have once been part of a Sphinx sculpture. So someone just took a little bit home with them. That's always nice. The origin and purpose of these claws of course, remain uncertain. Now, some theories suggest that they were brought from Egypt or represent the influence of Egyptian culture in the region. One of the two. Someone stole it or someone was inspired. One of the two. Others propose alternative explanations, such as symbolic or decorative elements. However, without further evidence or historical context, we don't really know, because this was, I don't know, 3,000 years ago. Where did these hands come from? They're scary, but we'll never know. It is fascinating. I just wanted to show you these cool hands.
Despite not knowing how he died, we know after he did, there was a big ol' succession mess. Post-Tut, the pharaoh plot gets all dicey. Horma was the chosen heir for the throne and was off waging war against the Hittites. The coup theory for Tut's death revolved around his elderly chief advisor Ai, because we do not know how or why a high official like him came to be king of Egypt otherwise. He definitively stole the crown and throne from Horeme in his absence though. Ancient letters suggest that either Nefertiti or, more likely, Tut's widow Akhenaten was desperate to prevent Ai from becoming pharaoh and asked the king of the Hittites, who they were at literal war with, to send a prince who could marry her and rule Egypt. An and Nefertiti are erased from history around that time. During his short reign, King Ai tried in vain to achieve peace with said Hittites, while also simultaneously trying to prevent Horeme, the true regent of Tut, from seizing the throne while he's alive and after he died. To do so, he named an heir, an army commander named Nakahimti, who we know as perhaps to be Ai's own grandson. As you can imagine, Nakahimti became Harambe's great rival, but Ai's successor would finally be Horem when his 3-year reign ends. Horem would then rule for nearly 30 years and then remove all known history of Tut and Taa, Nefertiti, and Tut's father, Ak. Now that's a mystery as to why. And while we're on the topic, where is An? For over 3,000 years, her life has been a mystery to us and mostly made up of bizarre facts and strange omissions, like that despite being the third daughter of the pharaoh, she was once his wife too, before marrying her half-brother Tut. When Tut died, the corrupt priests chose an heir, General Harambe, known lunatic. Anne was terrified and realized the kingdom was being lost to corruption and secret societies. She potentially writes to the King Hittites during their time of war as mentioned, offering herself and the throne of Egypt to one of his sons. The prince in specific was Zanzanea, and he set out for Egypt and is killed before he arrives. Historians believe this was Horemheb's doing. Anne is forced to marry Ai so he can steadfastly secure his place on the throne, and then like that, she vanishes from history, an absence that some historians say signal her death. But it isn't the only time that has fragmented her story. An's role of ancient Egypt's most contentious period was lost deliberately, excised from the annals of history by the new dynasty that rose to power just decades later. DNA testing, she may have been one of the female mummies found in Key V21, but for now, she remains shrouded in mystery. The story of the Cobra and Canary is next. Howard Carter, self-taught archaeologist, plunderer, thief, and is responsible for the discovery and opening of King Tut's tomb. Prior to said opening, he had bought a golden canary, hoping its chatter and song would cheer up his empty house. When he first brought it home, one of his housemates tells Carter, "It's a bird of gold that will bring luck. This year we will find a tomb full of gold." Well, howdy doody, either that bird summoned gold or the maid is a fortune teller. Within a week of purchasing the canary, Carter discovers Tut's tomb. And before knowing whose tomb they had found, the workers nicknamed it the Tomb of the Golden Bird, a bird that becomes an omen of what's to come. During the recent excavations which led to the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, Mr. Howard Carter had in his house a canary which daily regaled him with its happy song. On the day, however, on which the entrance to the tomb was laid bare, a cobra entered the house, pounced on the bird, and swallowed it. Now, cobras are rare in Egypt and seldom seen in winter, but in ancient times they were regarded as symbol of royalty, and each pharaoh wore the symbol upon his forehead as though to signify his power to strike and sting his enemies. And obviously this segues us to the classic mystery of the mummy's curse. I'm of the opinion anyone who pillages or destroys history deserves to have a curse, so Howard Carter and company, please continue rolling in your graves, bud. You earned this. So, George Herbert funded the excavation and died from blood poisoning days later. Legend has it, when the Lord Carnarvon died, all the lights in his house and in Cairo, Egypt mysteriously went out. Howard Carter gave a mummified hand wearing a bracelet inscribed saying, "Cursed he be who moves my body," to his friend Bruce Ingham as a gift. Ingham, that man did not like you. His house burned to the ground not long after, and when he tried to rebuild, it was hit by a flood. George J. Gould dies after one visit. Aubrey Herbert dies of gum rot. Hugh Evelyn White takes his own life, but not before writing in blood, "I have succumbed to the curse which forces me to disappear." Aaron Ember and his whole family dies, and Richard Bethel is suffocated by apparently the Satanist Aleister Crowley of all people. Archibald Douglas Richard died 3 days after X-raying Tut, and then James Henry Breasted dies on his next Egypt trip. Mystery, or what do you think? And last on our list is the alien jewel. The amazing story began 77 years after Carter's discovery, when an Italian geologist noticed something odd about the yellow-green scarab in the pectoral center. The subsequent tests proved that the lump of glass was older than any Egyptian society, a lot older, in fact. Experts trace this scarab back to the Great Sand Sea, 500 miles southwest of Cairo, in which there are known to be huge lumps of glass poking out of the dunes. The general opinion is that a meteor hit the desert hundreds of thousands of years ago, heating the sand enough to create glass. To give you the idea of the magnitude that this supposed impact, the first A/B testing done created a thin frost-like layer of glass in the New Mexico desert. Meanwhile, chunks of glass the size of literal human heads can be picked up from the Great Sand Sea to this day. That means this meteor hit with an impact that we humans can't recreate on a different type of scale. But there's no evidence of a meteor that has ever struck the desert. If this glass is of meteoric origin, then there should be a crater of that age, says Boston University Farouk Al-Baz. But no crater, let alone partially fused or a serial piece, has ever been found. This suggests the less exciting origin, a supersaturated lake of silica that slowly dried into a natural glass hard enough to resist a scalpel mark.
Number 10. Comet Neowise. Summer 2020. Remember that one? When everything was closed and the world was panicking? That was a good time. For a few days there, we were all distracted by something in the night sky, something beautiful. Do you remember this? It was Comet Neowise. Did you see it? If so, I'm extremely jealous. I woke up at 5 a.m. to catch a glimpse of Neowise, and I couldn't see anything. I walked home with binoculars in my hand at 6 a.m. like a weirdo. What's going on there? Well, as beautiful as this phenomenon was, many considered this comet a bad omen, believe it or not. Until the 16th century, comets were usually considered bad omens, perhaps the death of kings or coming catastrophes. Now, considering Comet Neowise was discovered March 27th, 2020, some can connect it to the catastrophe that was the pandemic. A few months late of a warning, but thanks for the heads up, I guess. Comet Neo not so wise, rather, I don't know. Number 9, deadly date. My sleeves are so long. It's getting longer. For many, the 4th of July is a celebration, right? It's a hoot and or holler. Even up here in Canada, we hear all the commotion and it sounds way more fun than Canada Day, you know what I mean? Fireworks, hot dogs, grown men sitting in the back of their pickup trucks arguing about sports. It's beautiful, it's a vibe. But did you know July 4th historically is one of the deadliest dates out there? 3 out of the first 5 presidents of the United States all died on the same day. July 4th. And if that's not crazy enough for you, 2 of them passed on the same day within hours of each other. That's right, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4th, 1826. The same day. 5 years later, July 4th, James Monroe also passed away. That's pretty spooky. That's a very specific Final Destination movie right there that needs to be made. Number 8. Lincoln and Booth. Since we're on the topics of American presidents, I'll bring in one of the craziest coincidences in history. Now, it's common knowledge at this point, or at least I hope so, to understand the demise of President Lincoln. He was, taken out, if I can say that, he was taken out at the opera by one John Wilkes Booth back in 1864. Now, before this happened, and I mean months earlier, Abraham Lincoln's son fell off a train platform. And who reached down to save him? Why, it was Edwin Booth, the son of John Wilkes Booth. Yeah, he was like, hey, close one, right? See you in a bit. Number 7, balloon fate. In 2001, a young girl in Staffordshire, England, took a balloon and wrote, "Please return to Laura Buxton." The note even had her address on it. And then she let this balloon and the note go. The winds just took it elsewhere, alright? Now this balloon, again with her address and all of her information, ended up traveling 140 miles and ended up in Wiltshire where a farmer found it. Now it turns out his neighbor had a daughter named Laura Buxton. So confused, he brought this balloon to that Buxton family, and that Laura wrote to Balloon Laura's address, which again was written on the note that they just gave away to the general public. She wrote back explaining how her family ended up with the balloon, and after the parents arranged a meeting, the Lauras discovered that apart from their names being identical, they were both 10 years old, both had a pet black lab, both had a rabbit, and both had a guinea pig. They also both told their story on a podcast in 2009, in case you don't believe me. Now look, as fascinating as this is, coincidence-wise, do I think it's a good idea to write your 10-year-old daughter's address on a balloon and then let it go? No, that's really not a great idea at all. That's a horrible, horrible gamble. Do not try that one at home. Hey, this is where I live. Number 6, Mark Twain and the Comet. Oh, you thought we were done with cosmic coincidences? Well, think again, pal. American author Mark Twain, he loved a satire, right? Loved novels or two, but apparently he could also predict the future. Yeah, who knew? Mark Twain was born in 1835, the same year Halley's Comet just happened to pass by. The next time Halley's Comet reappeared was in 1910, and this also happened to be the same year that Mark Twain died. Even more unbelievable here, a year before he died in 1909, Mark Twain said something that we can't get out of our heads. It kind of hints towards his death almost. He said, quote, "The Almighty has said, no doubt, now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, and they must go out together." End quote. Could Mark have been referring to himself and the comet? If so, he kinda nailed it.
Number 5, the plague of Justinian. But things weren't about to get any better anytime soon. It wasn't just crop failure and famine they had to worry about. Soon, the bubonic plague was upon them. A couple years later in 541, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, adding more woe to misery. It became known as the plague of Justinian as it swept through the Roman port of Pelusium, Egypt, causing the deaths of half the Eastern Roman Empire's population. This in turn, according to, once again, Michael McCormack, sped up the final demise of the once great empire. The plague struck Asia, North Africa, Arabia, and Europe, taking the lives of a colossal 30 to 50 million people. And now there weren't that many people back then, so this would have really made a dent. The same disease would return centuries later and would be known as the Black Death. The reason it was called the Plague of Justinian this time around was due to the poor response from the Byzantine ruler. He was unable to complete the projects he had started due to the farmers and workers dying by the thousands, so he decided to raise taxes and change the tax code. He not only demanded taxes from the people still alive, but demanded they pay the ones owed by their fallen neighbors as well. So not a good time. Number 4, some benefits. There were some. Now, though scientists like to say this is the worst time to be alive in history, it depends where you were, and it depends where you live. I mean, I keep thinking that maybe World War II was probably worse, or World War I, I just don't know. But it was just such a long extended period of time. If you lived in the Arabian Peninsula, however, you may have actually been kind of grateful for it, you know? Due to the catastrophe, their weather changed for the good. They actually experienced more rainfall. This helped their crop and vegetation thrive. They had so much left over they could give more to their camels. As a result, they were able to build larger camel herds to help facilitate transport for Arab armies aiding in conquests during that century. It also may have influenced agricultural development in Estonia with their production of rye. In Finland, hunting and fishing were their main sources of livelihood, so the lack of land production didn't really bother them. They were like, okay, cool, I've got this reindeer. Number 3, snow in China. China, on the other hand, was freaking the heck out. It snowed in the summer. In the summer! I cannot imagine like a more depressing thing to happen, okay? I really can't. I mean, I remember one time in May, it snowed after like 2 weeks of just like beautiful weather, and it snowed again after the longest winter. It was the most depressing moment of my life. Anyways, in some parts of China, the weather was so bad that 70 to 80% of the population starved to death. So on top of the famine, it was the weather and all this stuff. Despite this event though, South China seemingly remained peaceful and prosperous under the Liang dynasty, which lasted from 502 to 49. However, economic pressures and internal strife within the Northern Wei Empire continued to cause trouble. The Northern Zhao was finally defeated in 581, and the South asserted control over the North. This led to the final linking of North and South China when Emperor Wen began construction of a canal system connecting the two parts of China together. Number 2, economic downturn. So obviously, with the fact that agricultural production was way down, workers were dying left, right, and center, an economic downturn soon followed the wave of plague and the mist. As previously mentioned, rulers such as Justinian raised taxes like crazy, burying his empire in debt. But just how bad did it get? Well, the study of seeds found in excavations tell a pretty bleak story. They found a high number of grape seeds in the ancient trash mounds. So what does that matter? Well, by going through each seed individually, acidification, they noticed a steep rise in the amount they found and then all of a sudden a steep decline of grape pips. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, was pretty well known for their sweet wine that they sold, and they had connections with other parts of Europe that they sold it to, which means the steep decline in the seeds indicates that their economic ties took a huge hit. And last but not least, let's tie this whole thing together with survival. So how in the heck did we survive this thing? It was one foul hit after another. Bad weather, famine, plague, economic downturn, war, people being the worst. Well, a lot of it just had to play out on its own. The plague eventually died down, the planet started to slowly warm up, and along with those changes, the economy started to recover, though it would take over a century for it to actually be effective again. In the mid 7th century, Europeans began melting silver from lead ore, which led to the merchant class for the first time. This was a huge step. The Byzantines dedicated themselves to the preservation of history, and even though Justinian was the worst financially at the time, the critical reform he made regarding the legal system and those pesky construction projects set them on the right path for the future. So there you have it, folks. Though it was an insanely bleak period in history, we got out of it eventually. Slowly but surely, we just gotta keep going.
Starting with the classic case, deathbed and breakfast. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. While the rhyme isn't true in all senses, Abby Dufresne Borden was her stepmother and the weapon was a hatchet, not an axe, it is right in the description of Jackson and Abby Borden being slayed remorselessly and beyond recognition in their beds the morning of August 4th, 1892. In the early hours after the discovery of the bodies, people only knew that the killer had struck the victims in their home in broad daylight on a busy street 1 block from the city business district. There was no evident motive. No neighbors and passersby heard nothing. No one saw a suspect enter or leave the Borden property. But the perfect Sunday school teacher, Lizzie, was inside the whole time. Lizzie was later arrested and charged for the deaths of her parents, but was acquitted by a jury in the following year of 1893 despite having lied about calling a doctor, never crying for her family, and buying literal poison right before they died. Cultural, religious, class, ethnic, and gender divisions in the town would shape the debates over Lizzie's guilt or innocence and ultimately free her. Overall, just being a spoiled, privileged white woman in this specific time played a role in letting Borden, the definitive killer of her parents, go free. And into the pit of bones we now go. National Geographic calls it the world's oldest M-word mystery, and it's safe to say that this killing is one that will never be solved. The victim was discovered in eerily named Pit of Bones in Spain. It's a fascinating archaeological site even without the discovery of an ancient killing. Researchers have found it's the final resting place for around 28 individuals who were somewhere between Neanderthals and modern humans. It's one of those finds that makes the scientific community foam at the mouth, and it turns out criminologists would probably now like this one too, because the victim had been laying exactly where he was thrown for a shocking 430,000 years. So how can we tell this just wasn't another burial? The others were of different ages, showing signs of conditions that would make daily life impossible without a caregiver, and most were actually, properly buried. The fact that the mysterious victim's wounds never started to heal made it clear no one ever wanted them to be discovered. The killing blow caused 2 identical mirror skull fractures, something anthropologists, crime or hysterical status otherwise, can agree is a common result of blunt force trauma. The body was then thrown down 43 feet into a cave to rest for thousands of years. A bit more recent history is a fear of water. On November 29th, 1981, around 7:30 a.m., actress Natalie Wood's body is found floating face down in the Pacific Ocean, about 200 yards offshore. She'd been one of Hollywood's recognizable names and faces. You may recognize her from airings of Miracle on 34th Street each holiday season. Eerily, Woods' mother had taken Natalie to a fortune teller for fun as a child. Wasn't so fun because she told Natalie that she would die by drowning one day. It inspires paralyzing fear in her as a child. She's afraid to even wash her hair and had reoccurring nightmares. Then Christopher Walken one day joins Natalie and her husband Robert Wagner and Dennis DeVerne on a yacht weekend. The group left in the afternoon on November 27, 1981, and Robert berates Natalie all evening. On the 28th, after a dinner and lots of drinking with Walken, the two reboard the dinghy at 10 p.m. Witnesses from a nearby boat claim they heard shouts at midnight. However, there's a party going on nearby. They thought it was from the party and they didn't intervene. One of the witnesses, John Payne, Kane said he heard a woman scream, "Help me! Someone help me!" coming from the stern of Wood's yacht. But then he thought he heard a man's voice say, "Okay, honey, we'll come get you." But the tone was so mocking, he thought it came from the party. According to Wagner, there was a non-violent argument that broke out between him and Walken over politics. Woods was bored with it and went to bed, and Wagner didn't realize she was missing until he went to kiss her goodnight at 1:30 a.m. The Coast Guard's alerted, and Wood is found floating 6 hours later about a mile away from the yacht and the dinghy not too far from her. Angeles County coroner ruled her cause of death as accidental drowning and hypothermia. Woods' sister Lana expressed doubts about this being accidental, as have many, and it remains unsolved. Watch your step or you'll be looking like him, the Graball Bog Man. The remains of the Graball Bog Man were discovered by a peat cutter working in the bogs in 1952. Imagine the poor dude finding that. The eerie, well-preserved state of the body, thanks to the horrifying yet magical workings of bogland, has allowed experts to learn some incredible things. They can tell, for example, he lost a front tooth when he was somewhere around 5 years old. His last meal was cereal, they know that because the hallucinogenic ergot fungus was found in his stomach and intestines, but before the snap, crackle, pop, he had had a meat-heavy diet. What they haven't been able to determine is why he was killed, cause it wasn't the poison mold this time. One injury, the fractured skull, happened after his death. The broken leg, however, likely happened around the time he was killed. It seems as though he was hit with a blunt object that shattered his shin and swept him off his feet, just in time for an incredibly sharp blade to cut his throat. Whomever had done it had grabbed him from behind, Ramesses III style, and cut so deep it went to his spine. The Graball Man died somewhere between 400 and 200 BC, and all signs point to him being perfectly ordinary Iron Age farmer, someone's pop or neighbor. Who wanted him dead and why? Next up is two samurai with one stone. Sakamoto Ryoma is a iconic Japanese figure, best remembered as the man who brokered the peace deal between the warring provinces of Satsuma and Chosu so as to conquer the shogunate. Yet as Ryoma's influence grew, so did his enemies, and on December 10th, 1867, just a month after the restoration of imperial power, he, alongside his ex-sumo wrestler bodyguard and fellow samurai Nakaoka Shintaro, are killed. The bodyguard was the first to be slain after answering the door to a guest who wished to see Ryoma, who from upstairs hears this scuffle, opens his door to shout down at his bodyguard to knock it off because he thought he was wrestling with a friend. Instead, Ryoma is charged at. A confused melee ensues as lamps are knocked over and the room became dark. Ryoma is beyond injured, missing limbs and parts of his forehead, and he dies later that night, regretting with his last words that his killers caught him unprepared. Shintaro survives only to succumb to injuries 2 days later, never regaining enough consciousness to identify assassins, but mentioning hearing a specific dialect amongst the killers. The night of the killing was eventually called the Omiya Incident. The professional killers were never discovered or distinguished, yet they are presumably individuals from a master shogun bunch. Ryoma is still venerated as one of Japan's most noteworthy and most regarded legends. Number 5, girls go to Mars and boys go to Venus, but what if they unionized instead? Not their journey to another planet, of course, but Nostradamus did predict the union of a masculine and feminine force, describing their alliance will be short-lived, as will its good effects. Numerous finger pointings will be happening this year, tying news stories across the year to this statement, because even now we can't find any consistent opinions or direct comparisons on what this could mean. It is once again a possible commentation on royal families Harry and Meghan and their subtle siege to air out the royal family, or is it perhaps an unexpected union of two of our world leaders of the opposite sex making political waves? Some discuss this may refer to real social change, again with the woman of Iran being a fantastic example as people of the world uplift their voices. This may be the time where patriarchal countries begin to consolidate and adhere to the needs and demands of women's equity. There's been a long time push globally for attacks against women, especially women of color and the LGBTI community, to be addressed. Maybe in 2023 we'll see some of that change as man and woman and everyone in between unite to bring social and economic change for both sexes. Number 4 is enough to give me nightmares: inflation. Yeah, our boy Nostradamus predicted inflation, and I want to meet the person who didn't slap the quill out of his hand when he was writing it down. I mean, come on, do us future people a favor. Anyway, Nostradamus wrote down that when there are no abbots, monks, or novices to teach, honey will cost much more than candle wax, the price of wheat will be high, man will be agitated and eat his friend in despair. Now, inflation is nothing new and we would have had it happen even without this prediction, but Nostradamus is also commenting on the generalized breakdown in food supply chains. We saw this as a result of pandemic and shipment blockades from certain countries we no longer support the economy of. He's even addressed the cost of food and how its price has soared. Now obviously we can't glide past that last bit in the sentence wherein Nostradamus highly implies that we may get a little snacky towards our fellow man, something he believes will happen due to inflation and food
food shortages. I'd like to think we're above this, but unfortunately, as you'll see in media nowadays, people can surprise you. Little Devil is number 3 in the countdown. The Antichrist very soon annihilates the Three. 27 years his siege will last. The unbelievers are dead, captive and exiled, with blood, bodies, water, and red hail covering the earth. Whew, that's a heavy one. Bit dramatic too. Can't really see that being good. Now, Antichrist of course can be metaphorical. It's not like the grounds are gonna crack open and some red dude is gonna come flying through with horns. News outlets have equated the figure of the Antichrist to a certain world leader that we have already seen wreaking havoc. It can also represent a group of people who when together are an oppressor. This could be a corrupt government, fringe political groups, or hate movements. Unfortunately, there is no shortage of these groups or people as the media is flooded with stories of devastation from across the world. It's easy to see our society is essentially crowbarring these Nostra predictions to fit our tragic era, eh? Number 2 is evicting leprechauns. Sorry, had to have some fun with the title, because in this prediction, Nostradamus talks about the effects of climate change by using rainbows. For 40 years, the rainbow will not be seen. For 40 years, it will be seen every day. And the dry earth will grow more parched, and there will be great floods when it is seen. Essentially 40 years of dusty, ashy earth, 40 years of soggy, flooded earth. This Nostra prediction comes at a time when Europe has experienced its worst drought in 500 years. And additionally, Africa is suffering through its longest and most devastating drought in history. And I mean, look outside. Even in notoriously frigid Canada, January is rainy and low in temperature instead of mountains of snow, ice, and igloos. Outside of being a commentation on climate change being at an actionable point, this does imply we'd somehow survive through intense weather changes to see them. Some believe this is only because certain areas of the globe will be affected. In this next and final prediction of our list, Nostradamus predicted 2 regions of France would ultimately be unbothered by much of his predictions for this year. Hear that? Should have taken your French classes more seriously. Number 1 is a prediction nobody wants to be true. Global conflicts. Nostradamus was cranky when he wrote the year 2023 evidently, because he's kind of ruining the vibe for us here. His prediction is for 7 months of great battle, continuing on to describe the demise of many through evil. Seeing as there are 3 different sets of countries that are currently experiencing some territory disputes with each other in 3 areas of our planet, not to mention some countries whose governing systems are going after their own people, any short time on social media or watching the news will catch you up to date quickly on what's happening between them and their increasing tensions or actions. As mentioned previously, Nostra highlighted that 2 regions of France, it seems, will be untouched by this chaos. Are the rich planning to flee and set up a selfish community of safety? Are these areas of France so rural that maybe they're just excluded? We aren't sure. Unfortunately, there's little more than we can do than stay informed, stay vigilant, and support the global cause of human rights.
We're gonna start with the classic, Who's My Mummy? Around the year 1341 BC, a royal child is born by the name of Tut-Mahaten, the living image of Aten. Sometime after Dad's death, Tut rebrands to Tut-Mahan. This is because his dad is the legendary dumb Akhenaten, who tries to force monotheism. Anyways, some scholars believe that Tut's mom was Ak's principal wife, Nefertiti, but others believe his mother was the secondary wife named Kia. But with either theory, we run into the issue that it's not entirely certain that Ak was even Tut's father. Getting cheated on by both wives, that's when you know you're doing something wrong. It's quite possible that Tut's father was the pharaoh Smun-Akhara. While DNA tests of several mummies found in the Valley of Kings seem to indicate that Tut's father and mother are buried not far, Egyptologist Marianne Eaton Cross also points out that whereas these mummies are very clearly close relatives of Tut, it's actually difficult to establish precise familial relationships using only DNA. Egyptian royal families like to preserve the bloodlines, so his mom could also biologically be his sister and cousin, and all of that would show up as an indecipherable mix that does nothing to confirm more than just a relation. If it is Nefertiti, the question remains, where's my mummy? In more recent years, speculation about King Tut's tomb is that Queen Nefertiti, whose tomb and sarcophagus are long lost to us, is buried somewhere within. This claim is made by Egyptologist Nicholas Reeve, who realized that the cartouches depicting Tut had been buried by his pharaonic successor Ai had been painted over cartouches of Tut burying Nefertiti. Reeve said close inspection of Ai's cartouches revealed clear underlying traces of an earlier name, that of Tut. In its original version, this scene had shown Tut performing the funerary rite over the tomb's original owner, his his immediate predecessor Nefertiti. The new evidence, specifically the north and east walls of the treasury being man-made structure whilst everything else is cut stone, does support the theory that Tut's tomb is only an outer section of a much larger tomb prepared for and still occupied by Nefertiti, whose own independent sequence of funerary chambers lies beyond. It would also add context as to why the king had such a small, oddly shaped burial chamber. But if someone does lay beyond those walls and it's not Nefertiti, then knock knock, who's there? Few scholars share Reeves' optimism that any new chambers contain Nefertiti's tomb. There's something about her specifically that fills archaeologists with dread and defeat, like she's the popular hot girl at school who would never look at them. The desire to find her mummy is potent, as it would be a tremendous discovery and greatly contribute to the study of ancient Egypt. Frank Rahel of the University of Zurich compiled a list of other royal relatives that he felt could be interred there, including Tut's older sister, Mary Hatton, his possible mother Kia, and of course Smenkhahera. There is a belief, however, that if it is Smen, while Nefertiti died, Tut had her interred with him. Possibly because, as mentioned, the dude could be his dad, but also maybe Tut knew his mom loved this guy more than Ak. I don't know, I don't got time for ancient Egyptian Kardashian drama right now. All I'm saying is Tut could have cracked that tomb open, buried Nefertiti, closed it back up, and when he died he got buried in the frontmost room. But to appeal to my ancient alien theorists, is it alien matter? On the flip side of educated leaps, we have alien conspiracy. Egypt's own antiquities ministry announced a few years ago that there were signs of extraterrestrial activity discovered after some radar scans of King Tut's tomb. The radar scans, according to French archaeologist Avril Sapp, refuted theories that Queen Nefertiti's tomb is hidden beyond that of King Tut, and instead revealed weird and extraterrestrial material appeared to resemble a body. However, both Sapp and unnamed antiquity officials refused to answer questions concerning whether or not it could be alien remains. But the AO did confidently boast they could not even come up with something like this in the National Treasure or Indiana Jones movies. This is revolutionary. We don't know what there is, but we've never seen results like this before, said Sapp, who coincidentally discovered dinosaur bones in the Pyramid of Giza a few years ago on April 1st, 2014. Whatever's inside of there could hold secrets to everything behind ancient Egyptian history and technology. Egypt will continue to conduct radar testings and scannings to determine how to enter the hidden chamber without damaging anything inside. Next on the roster, how do you die? One important question that's likely never going to be answered by anything that might be contained in newly discovered chambers is how Tut died. Let's run through some of the many options, shall we? Was it A, King Tut's knee was broken so badly that it was a compound, the bone piercing the skin and causing massive bleeding? Although a fatal leg fracture fits the idea that Tut had died abruptly, it cannot be stated for medical certainty that the fracture occurred while Tut was alive. It's possible his knee was broken after death. Was it B, Tut's death was caused by an infection that resulted from said fracture? Not the result of a chariot crash, by the way, since Tut's physical impairments would have made chariot racing impossible. His immune system was weakened from several bouts of malaria. But maybe it was C, Tut may have been killed by an elderly chief advisor and successor I. An x-ray of his skull revealed calcified blood clot at the base, and it could have been caused by a blow from a blunt instrument. Or maybe it's D. New analysis of CT scans from 03 show Tut was embalmed without his heart and anterior chest wall, structures that couldn't have been removed by tomb robbers or anyone else. The assumed cause was an extensive crushing and tearing injury like the bite of a hippopotamus. And like mother like son, let's talk about the death of Caesarion, because in 48 BC, Egyptian leader Cleopatra one day has an idea. Nude, she gets wrapped up in a carpet and her servant FedExes her over to the Roman leader Caesar's crib, where he unfurls the carpet and bam, smoking hot young naked chick. Thinking like the CEO of Hooters restaurants worked like a charm, especially since dirty old Caesar is like 30 years older than her at the time. Their unionizing caused a lot of politically, but it also resulted in Caesarion, the pair's only child. He was born in June of 47 BC and only returned to Egypt once Daddy Caesar had been assassinated. But Mama Cleo has big goals. She wants Rome, baby. So she whips her clothes off and tosses herself at Mark Antony, the Caesar successor. He and Cleo establish a union, and apparently she was so good at unioning, he gave her a literal dominion over the massive empire, and Caesarion appointed the King of Kings. Ladies, always remember, this works. But As mentioned, August of year 30 rolls around and Mark Antony takes his life and died in Cleopatra's arms. Cleopatra following suit. Plutarch wrote that Caesarion had been sent to India, but also that he was lured back under false promises. Rawdon, a tutor, persuaded him to go back on the ground that Octavian invited him to take the kingdom of Egypt. Kid sadly falls for it, goes back, and his boat touches shore and the Romans descended upon him. Octavian is supposed to have had the pharaoh Caesarion executed in Alexandria following the advice of Arrius Didymus, who said too many Caesars is not good. Good Homer pun, dude. And yet the exact circumstances of his death and location of his body are not documented. His body has never been found and historians don't know how he died. They don't know where even. They don't know if he was captured and taken to the palace. Maybe there he bartered for his life and was exiled elsewhere, growing up and dying without notoriety. We have no idea. Taking a stroll 1 minute, dead the next. Poor old archbishop. Alright, so it's a little less ancient, but still pretty far back, and it's still unsolved. So, born in 1893 in the district of Matai, Egypt, Theophilus was taught Copic language and Orthodox doctrine from the womb. That's how he ended up being a tonsured reader in 1902. That's someone who read religious texts out loud for folks, since most people were illiterate. He starts as a monk in a monastery of St. Anthony the Great in 1910, given the Mosaic name Monk Peter of St. Anthony. He was then ordained to the priesthood in 1915. Then Theophilus gets another promotion and another. From 1921 to 31, this guy's just hustling through the religious ranks, even being appointed abbot of monastery and being nominated for the Pope on 2 occasions. He loses out but nails the title of Metropolitan of Jerusalem and Archbishop of all Palestine, Philadelphia of Jordan, and all Near East. That's a big one. In 1935. As Metropolitan of Jerusalem, he continued the works and renovations and constructions of the church properties in the Holy Land, just doing a lot of good for his people and community, as all this preamble tells you. But then Monday, October 1st of 1945, Theophilus was popped while walking from the monastery of St. Anthony the Great in the eastern desert to the nearby village of Bush. No enemies, no quarrels, angry parishioners. The circumstances and reasons for the killing are unclear, and the perpetrator was never identified. This was also more of an era of knives and bludgeoning, so finding someone who had the right weapon for a bullet wasn't that hard, yet no one had ever been found. Now we're gonna do the opposite and go insanely far back in history. I'm talking pre-dynastic death. They're called the Gabelline mummies, and there are 6 in total, all naturally mummified and dating back to approximately 3400 BC, the late pre-dynastic period. This is the first ever complete bodies found from that period, and they were all excavated at the end of the 19th century. In this period, bodies were usually buried naked and sometimes loosely wrapped. When the body's covered in warm sand, the environmental conditions evaporate or drains the water of the body quickly, and the corpse is naturally dried and preserved. It's believed this traditional method was the source for the original Egyptian belief in after-death survival and started the tradition of leaving food and implements for an afterlife. In 2012, they make a unique discovery. A CAT scan of one of the mummified bodies showed that it was a man, aged about 18 to 20 at the time, and hella buff, but also hella killed by someone else. A puncture under his left shoulder blade was made with such force it shattered a rib and punctured his lung. It was believed that the injury was caused by a copper blade or flint knife at least 12 centimeters in length and 2 centimeters wide. The man had been taken by surprise as the attack had no defensive wounds. Naturally, the British government stole these mummies as usual, and they remain in their possession and collection to date. But don't worry, the priceless artifacts also found at the graves weren't stolen by the British Museum, just by the British archaeologists and excavators themselves. Now those pieces remain lost forever, and since 1901, the first body excavated remained disrespectfully on display in the British Museum. Don't know why they call it that when there isn't a single British item in there. This is an we are still uncovering the secrets of how Ramesses towed the line. I love my puns. This was a very unstable chapter of Egypt's history. The endless war with the sea people draining the treasury, the climate change, political unrest, all the good stuff that leads to a high-level conspiracy in 1155 BC. The courtiers, military, sorcerers, harem, hell, even his wife Tia was in on this. And sure, while the killers who were wielding the weapons will probably never be identified, an ancient document titled the Judicial Papyrus of Turin details the plot to kill Ramesses III, and that his secondary wife Tia and her son Pentawere conspired with each other against the pharaoh, who would select an heir from a more senior wife. Alright, so the death itself. 2012 is when a CT scan finally reveals to us how Ramesses died. He had had his throat slit so viciously it severed esophagus and trachea, an instant death. But they also found evidence he was killed by multiple assailants. Ramesses had one of his big toes hacked off, and the wound never had time to heal, meaning it likely happened at the same time as his throat was cut. The shape of the cuts also indicate a different weapon used than the one of the cut of the throat, as does the fact his toes are broken. The likelihood is there was an assailant with an axe, in the front and one coming from behind with a dagger. Then we learned that the embalmers attempted to hide Ramesses' wounds, performing a little post-mortem cosmetic surgery. They fashioned a fake toe out of linen and covered it with heavy layers of resin. Thus, why the researchers in the 19th century couldn't get the linens off his feet, and the CT scan revealed to researchers why. Since his slaying was so notable, the ancient police and their baboons investigating the death had rounded up just about everyone they could find. Butlers, servants, nobles, and wives. They had plenty of chances to overhear the conspiracy, the courts ruled, and their failure to report it made them criminals. As punishment, their ears were cut off, because as far as the courts were concerned, they weren't making good use of them anyway. The one I'd be most excited to share, since nobody is gonna know who I'm talking about, the Hatshepsut slaying. Egyptian women shaved their heads in order to don wigs. It was better for their scalps under the hot sun, and it prevented diseases and lice. That's what made Hatshepsut an anomaly. She had her own hair, and it was peach in color. This suggests her hair was of great importance to her, and a cross-section of its DNA revealed something unexpected. Hatshepsut was somehow African, European, and Asian. How? Mitochondrial DNA allowed for testing to show she's of an ethnicity we don't have anymore, a rare H4A1 haplogroup. This haplogroup has never been found in ancient Egypt before, so let me repeat that: she's a literal ethnic race of human we don't have anymore, and the first known of their kind in Egypt. Mystery number 1 down. So how did this lovely lady die? It takes decades to determine that she'd been stabbed from behind, but the weapon was mistakenly thought as a knife at first. Recent discoveries now say a military axe was probably thrown at her from behind as she was running from her assailant. Naturally, the injuries from a flying axe hitting you are absolutely brutal, and her death was likely immediate. While the killer's believed to be an Assyrian soldier, Hatshepsut might have faced betrayal at the hands of one of her own people. Egyptian military and their peoples used the same axe as the Assyrians. Ancient Egyptians believed that the soul needed a body to reawaken, thus explained the effort to put in to cover Hatshepsut's wounds with as much resin and linens as possible. The scientists who reconstructed her face noticed its expression was overcast with a shadow of sadness, a reflection of emotion felt in her last moments. Though Hatshepsut's death was a nightmare, the years hypothesizing and investigating went into finding out everything about her possible. It wasn't just about how she died. They were about how she lived, and finally, people know this woman even lived.
Number 10, let's start out setting the scene. So rather than rank the least to worst aspects of this year, let's set the scene of how this became the worst year. Prior to 536, the early 500s were in some pretty heavy transitions. The Western Roman Empire had fallen to German invaders, and the Eastern sect would soon follow suit. The Middle East was divided between the Byzantine and the Persian empires. China's influence continued to spread through East Asia, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Even though it was experiencing a weak point, China was divided into both North and South territories, and they were constantly at odds with each other. Africa, however, was developing trade routes through the Sahara, and a powerful new kingdom was arising in Ethiopia. They wouldn't be heavily affected by this, but part of them would be. Peasants throughout Europe were used to the tradition of harvest seasons being reliable until one day all this movement and all this growth stopped. Number 9. The mist. A mysterious mist rolled in over Europe, clouding the sky in darkness. With the mist, a century of darkness would fall. Literally sounds like the setting of a Stephen King novel. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote about a portent that took place that year and said this, and I quote, "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. For the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it accustomed to shed. And from the time when this thing happened, men were free neither from war, nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death. The sun was eclipsed for 18 months. For 3 hours in the morning it would give light, but a light that resembled neither day nor night." Unquote. Other sources describe a cloud or dust veil that darkened the sky. Now, why did this happen? Here we are at number 8, eruption. Now, what on earth could have caused such a mysterious cloud of depression to seize the land? Well, after centuries of mystery, scientists have finally discovered what happened. It was a massive volcanic eruption that took place in Iceland. A professor of medieval history at Harvard University, Michael McCormick, led a study of a Swiss glacier which led to the discovery. Evidence of volcanic matter in the glacier proved that it was indeed a massive eruption that caused it. The ash from the eruption likely led to a fog that caused an 18-month period of darkness. It was so vast it spread across all of Europe, the Middle East, and portions of Asia. Number 7. Climate impact. This period of ominous and unexplained darkness led to serious negative transformations. A Roman politician by the name of Cassiodorus wrote that the sun looks bluish and that the moon had no luster. The seasons also seemed to be jumbled together into one. No summer, no spring, just a long, ever gloomy middle winter kind of thing. Another eerie fact he added was, and I quote, "We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon," unquote. The dark sunless days brought periods of cold, with temperatures falling as low as 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius all year round, making it the coldest decade in the past 2300 years. This is the closest the world got to the winter depicted in Game of Thrones, besides the actual Ice Age of course. This was called the mini antique Ice Age. Number 6. Starvation. But with the extreme cold, lack of sunlight, and seasons, crop failure destroyed many lives. Farmers no longer could look forward to a bountiful harvest in the fall, as basically nothing survived. The Irish chronicles show that they had a failure of bread of all things, from the years 536 to 539. Europe, parts of Asia, and the Middle East experienced a massive famine crisis. When did things get back to normal? Well, it took over a century for things to really start to turn back. Eventually, grit fell from the sky and slightly warmer temperatures returned, allowing for some crops to return. But the people had no way of knowing when that was going to happen. They just had to keep slugging along every day, watching their friends and families slowly die of starvation. Not a good time to be alive.
Number 5 in our countdown is the Andes plane crash that also happened on October 13, 1972. While the Russian airliner's victims were all killed on impact, the story of the ill-fated Air Force Flight 571 is one of extreme trepidation. After hitting an air pocket and being unable to regain altitude, the pilot lost control and the flight was slammed into an Andes mountain. The plane hit another 2 to 3 times before settling on the mountainside. 12 were instantly killed, 7 were pulled into Fields Gate before the plane's second impact, and another 4 died at final impact. 29 survivors were left sprawling along the icy mountainside, their plane's white fuselage all but invisible in the snow to any would-be rescuers that passed overhead. And after only 10 days, the survivors huddled around a radio listening to a broadcast saying that the search for their rugby team was called off. Imagine the defeat of that moment, realizing nobody was coming. Well, 2 of the survivors felt nothing but spite. They packed up and set out on foot. With no mountaineer or climbing experience, the men managed to survive 10 days and stumble across a local who alerted authorities to the situation. The 2 men managed to lead authorities back to where the remaining survivors, now only 16 of them due to an avalanche that decimated the fuselage and another 8, so that they were finally rescued in late December. This is an intense level of perseverance, but none more so than being pushed to cannibalism. While it was first met with public revulsion, forced perspective of the incident made it obvious that these men were reduced to a brutal but necessary decision. Using shards of glass, they slowly had to start picking away at their family and friends in order to survive for over a month. Of course, when asked 50 years later, survivors state that they did what they had to, and they would do it again if need be. March 13th, 1964 made psychology textbook infamy. Number 4, how 30+ people witnessed the crime without one person intervening. Kitty Genovese was returning from the bar where she worked around 3:15 a.m. in the morning and parked her car only 100 feet from her house. While walking in an alley to get home, she was attacked by Winston Moseley in the middle of the road that was surrounded by apartment buildings with windows overlooking the area. During this attack, she was stabbed twice, and Kitty managed to break free from Winston, screaming out repeatedly that she had been attacked. This was apparently heard by many neighbors, but only one of them, Robert Moser, opened his window and screamed at Moseley to let that girl be. For a second it worked. Winston fled, but only to return with his face disguised and finish the job. Kitty had lost a lot of blood and was barely able to move, making her unable to open her apartment. Winston found her in a back hallway of her building, where he stabbed her to death and unfortunately assaulted her. The attack spanned at least a half an hour total, and Kitty died en route to the hospital in an ambulance. This event was preventable as it was witnessed by over 30 people. No one called the police or intervened. Interviewed after the fact, the neighbors gave a myriad of excuses as to why they didn't. They didn't want to get involved or be nosy. They thought it was a lover's quarrel. The tragic case became a staple in psychology classes as a way to illustrate the bystander effect, or now called the Kitty Genovese effect, which occurs when people fail to act in a situation because they assume just someone else will step in. Moseley recently died in prison at the age of 81, deservedly. Number 3 in our countdown, April 13th, 1963, we're touching down in Jamaica to discuss the atrocities of the Coral Gardens massacre The Jamaican government was decimated by the acts of British colonialism, and when they finally pulled back from governing the country, it left the economy, housing, and job availability buckling. The Rastafarians of the time were viewed with suspicion and contempt and found themselves harassed by the authorities often. The story begins with Rasta convert Rudolph Franklin, who became embroiled in a land dispute. Franklin was farming illegally, and the landowners employed the services of the local police to evict the squatters. In an altercation erupted, and Franklin was shot 5 times. He was taken to the hospital and treated, but only to be immediately arrested for marijuana possession and sentenced to jail time. By the time Franklin was free, he was a rightfully bitter man. A year later, Franklin and several Rastas had been squatting peacefully on the land in Coral Gardens, part of Montego Bay, that the Jamaican government was planning to make into a tourist-only area, which meant it would become a no-go area for the Rastafarians. When the land was sold to Ken Douglas, who attempted to drive the squatters off of their rightful land, an all-out riot started at a gas station property. The building was burnt and 8 people died, including Rudolph Franklin. Prime Minister Sir Alex Bustamante was visiting the scene along with the Commissioner of Police and head of Jamaican Defense Force. Bustamante's response: bring all the Rastas in, dead or alive. Police was dispatched to Coral Gardens and the surrounding areas. More than 150 bearded men, assumed to be Rastafarians, were rounded up and arrested. The men were beaten, tortured, and some were even killed, and many had their locks cut off in a violent disrespect of their culture. Jamaican government officials have since apologized and put forth reparations to Rastafarians in 2017 for what they incurred that Friday the 13th. Number 2 in the countdown is the Paris attacks of November 13th, 2015. The attacks in Paris are remembered for their suddency and terror. While it's happening in the moment, it seemed that there was no end, no safety, and no place to run to. Functioning in 3 coordinated teams on the night of Friday the 13th, attackers hit the concert hall, a major stadium, restaurants, and bars almost simultaneously, and left 130 people dead and another approximate 413 wounded. At 9:20 p.m., the first attack happens at Stade de France. 5 minutes later, an attack happens in the 10th district on Rue Alibert. While emergency forces are scrambling to the first 2 locations, the nightmare's brief pause ends at 9:32 p.m. As a few streets south of Alibert, more attacks are reported at Café Bombière and La Casa Nostra Pizzeria in Rue de la Fontaine à la Roy. 4 minutes pass, and now it's attack reports from Rue de la Charonne at 9:38 p.m. Another 2 minutes pass, and the chaos ensues at Boulevard Voltaire. And then the final blow is between 9:40 p.m. and midnight, when a sold-out concert venue seating 1,500 fans of California rock band Eagles of Death was attacked at full force. By now, the president was in crisis talks with Prime Minister as well as interior ministers, and the president announced a state of emergency through France and a tightening of border controls. Please understand, while these locations weren't on opposite ends of the city, law officials are being hit with all of these events in rapid succession on what expected to be a normal night. They're understaffed, unprepared, and that's truly what was the most scary. November 13th, 1970 left a continent decimated. Number 1 in the countdown, one of the most tragic natural disasters in history happened Friday 13th, November 1970, when Cyclone Pahola hit Bangladesh. Found to be the equivalent in strength to that of a Category 3 hurricane, it sustained winds of 115 miles per hour, and a storm surge allowed the shallow waters of the Bay of Bengal to funnel ocean onto the land. According to a 1970 report of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the surge pushed water up 16 feet high. Devastatingly, due to the Indo-Pakistani friction at the time, it's believed that if either country had known much about the incoming storm, they didn't share it with each other. It was noted that a large amount of the population had no idea the storm was coming, and there was indication that East Pakistani's storm warning system was not used properly, costing tens of thousands of lives. With nowhere to evacuate, people climbed trees to escape rising water, and many were swept away. Research reports that in a 1972 journal, the highest survival rate was adult males aged 15 to 49, which is consistent with the impression that those who are too weak to cling to trees, such as old, young, sick, and malnourished, or females in general, were selectively lost to the storm. The Bahura cyclone confirmed 300,000 people, but it's believed to have taken the lives of 500,000 people, making it the deadliest tropical storm in history.